For weeks now, there has been a gnawing concern about the rising tide of gun violence in this city. There was another fatal shooting yesterday in the northwest end of the city, and of course the deaths of a 10-year-old girl and a young woman who's 18 on the Danforth this week have pushed that concern to new heights and added urgency to the question, what can we do? This summer's gun violence also points to real divisions in our city. Richard Florida has been thinking about that all week, professor in the U of T's School of Cities at the Rotman School of Management. He's also the author of The New Urban Crisis and co-wrote a piece in the Globe and Mail published this morning about curbing gun violence in the city. Richard's with me in studio now. Good morning.
It's great to be with you, man.
It's great to have you here. Why did you write this piece?
Well, I've lived in Toronto for 11 years now, and I came here from the States in part believing in my heart and soul that Toronto was a calm, safe, peaceful experiment in a mosaic of multiculturalism. And I think that's still the case. We'll get to it. But boy, oh boy, with the raft of gun shootings, the two events, the van ramming, the van attack, and now this mass shooting, the rash of deaths of cyclists and pedestrians, which we just heard about, again, another pedestrian killed last night, you can almost feel the anger and anxiety. And, my wife and I talk about this, and we're not saying that this is anywhere near the conditions of Baltimore or Cleveland or Pittsburgh, but it feels a little bit like the anger and anxiety we felt in the States. So that motivated me to kind of wrap my head around this and to co-write this piece.
And so when you take a look at the city that you're in right now, what do you see?
I do see a city of rising anger and anxiety, and I don't understand it. I mean, I can wrap my heads around the populist thing and the Ford thing and the Trump thing and Brexit, but, I do see this. And, what happened is I'm not an expert in urban violence. I have written on urban violence, both for The Atlantic and locally, but I sent out 3 emails to 3 leading experts in crime and violence to gain their insights. And this one fellow, Robert Muga, who's a Canadian but lives in Brazil and a real expert in urban violence in rapidly growing global cities. We really focused on this. And I think the bottom line is there is real cause for concern, but we're still in relatively good shape, even though it looks bad. And if you read the paper and see the headlines, it looks bad. I think the bottom line we came to is that compared to most other cities globally and most other Canadian cities, we're still relatively peaceful and safe, but boy, oh boy, we're almost at a tipping point that we need to do stuff.
One of the things that people have pointed to, and your colleague at the University of Toronto, dave-AWwDj69u-20180726, and others, is that this is not a city, it's cities now. And that we, even in the city of Toronto proper, if you whatever those barriers and boundaries are, have divided ourselves into 2 or 3 different cities. How do you see that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And David's work has had a profound influence on my own thinking and has caused me to reshape some of my own views. I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in Newark, New Jersey. My parents then moved to a working-class, middle-class suburb in North Arlington, New Jersey, Polish, Italian, Jewish, Latino, whatever. There was a society of social cohesion, especially in Toronto. A real mosaic where people could come and feel that they could buy a home, be part of a society, be part of a city of neighborhoods, middle-class neighborhoods. And as dave-AWwDj69u-20180726 has shown, that's no longer the case. I forget what his statistic is, but let's say roughly 3/4 of us lived in a middle-class neighborhood in the 1970s. Now maybe a third do. And I think it's that social cohesion, and then we fractured into these very small areas of concentrated advantage, almost like walled-off areas now, and these much larger spans of concentrated disadvantage. And one thing Robert Muga, my co-author, who knows a lot about, crime and violence is not randomly distributed in a city. It is very concentrated. And while these events, the van attack, the mass shooting on the Danforth, get our attention, really our urban violence problem is concentrated in neighborhoods and areas that are areas of isolation, areas of exclusion, areas of marginalization, and areas of poverty and economic dislocation.
And those shootings, there was a shooting in the northwest end of the city yesterday, don't get the same attention as those shootings in other areas.
At least I'll say one thing. We are alarmed by shootings in a way, in the way some cities in the States have become numb, and other places in the world, like Robert works on, in Latin and South America. But you're right. What gets our attention are the things that happen in the traditionally, high-profile neighborhoods, and the mass attacks and the van attacks. But yeah, our real violence problem lays in those areas of concentrated advantage. I've been looking at the maps. You've been looking at the maps. You can just see it. Our gun violence problem, like the gun violence problem in all other rapidly growing global cities, is concentrated in our poor and dislocated neighborhoods.
You wrote in the piece, the key to turning around gun violence requires mobilizing the marginalized communities that are most affected by that. There have been, we talked about this yesterday on the program, report after report after report about the roots of youth violence. We know sort of the evidence as to what needs to be done. How do you go about mobilizing those communities?
Well, I had a long conversation with Pat Sharkey. Pat is at NYU and a dear friend, and probably the leading expert on crime and violence in the United States. Pat wrote this incredible book called Uneasy Peace. They actually interviewed him in the Globe. It's a great interview in the Globe several weeks ago. But Pat's whole thesis is, yes, policing matters. We talk about in the piece technology-based, using technology and mapping and how important that is. Yes, better police tactics matter. But at the end of the day, it really is restitching the fabric of neighborhoods. And he shows this. He documents where there's been large crime declines in the U.S., it's come from neighborhood and community-based organizations. We got to get back to that. And I think part of it is, after X years of Harper, our city has had its own version of cuts. Ford in the province, we've really cut back our social safety net. And people – now, look, this is in no way in the condition of the United States or even the UK. We have a healthcare system that works. We have a social safety net. But still, it's fraying. Our public goods, our commitment to community is fraying. The other thing that we don't talk about in the piece, but Muga and I and others have talked about, the other is the mental health component of this. When people with mental health problems, who are more likely to be mass shooters than the people on the streets committing urban gun violence, gang members, when they're left at home in their parents' house, mom and dad can't really supervise them effectively. If they were in some kind of community-based program where they had professionals and peers that would look after them and make sure they don't have access to guns. So it's a whole panoply of things, but it really is about strengthening our communities and our community-based organizations.
If people experience the city differently depending on where they live in the city, are you hopeful that can be stitched up? We have a huge referendum, a municipal election coming this fall, where people will have different priorities, and presumably one of the priorities is to try and bring the city back together if it is as divided as you say. Are you optimistic that can be done?
I'm very optimistic about the future of Toronto. Look, at the end of the piece, we quote the statistics. Not only is Toronto multiple times less violent in terms of murders and gun violence than U.S. cities, it is still probably the least violent large city in Canada, and its rate of gun homicide is less than a national average.
And yet, if you speak with people, again, where some of that gun violence happens more frequently, they will say that they don't feel safe in their community.
And this is the point that another Rob Sampson at Harvard made. Once people start to feel this unease, it becomes a kind of an epidemic. I think one of the things going on, too, which I saw in the States, I didn't think was as big a problem here, silly me. Young people growing up in areas of concentrated disadvantage that are hardworking and entrepreneurial and ambitious take to selling drugs and take to illegal means to make money. And part of what comes with that territory is violence. So you also have to figure out ways to channel that energy effectively, give people the opportunities to make money, to be ambitious in the real economy. So we have multiple problems going on, but it really goes back to what you said. Making us one economy. Look, this isn't a problem unique to Toronto. This is a problem that every big, rapidly globalizing city is going through. When I look at the other global cities, we're in pretty good shape. But one thing that concerns me, Matt, is we still don't want to really admit this. We still want to see ourselves partly as a safe city and ignore many of the other aspects of petty crime, pedestrian, cycling deaths. They're all part of a piece, a growing anger and resentment and anxiety. So we have to come to grips with this as a community. But I am optimistic in the long run.
Richard, good to have you here. Thank you.
It's great to have you, and thanks for having this really critical conversation about the future of our city.
Richard Florida, professor at the University of Toronto School of Cities and the Rotman School of Management, co-wrote an op-ed for the Globe and Mail titled How Toronto Can Curb Gun Violence. If you want to have a look at that, we'll link it up on Twitter at Metro Morning. It's 21 minutes after 7. Jennifer's back.
TTC is doing well, but on the Kitchener GO train line, the 752 train from Georgetown and the 755 Kitchener train, both into Union Station, are reporting delays. Westbound 401 is congested. Express and collectors from Nielsen Road with a left lane collision after Markham Road on the Express, as well as a collision approaching the 404 and Don Valley Parkway Express, blocking the two right lanes. After that, you're filling in again. Express and collectors collectors after the 427 due to a truck fire just as you approach Dixie. It's on the collectors, reducing you down to one lane, the left lane.
19 degrees, high today of 28, mix of sun and cloud. Chance of showers later on this afternoon, maybe a thunderstorm as well. When you think of Canadian food, poutine, beaver tails might come to mind. An exhibit at the University of Toronto tries to show how messy and complex that phrase, Canadian food, is. Curators Liz Rodolfo and Arina Mahalaki, pardon me, let me get that right, Mahalaki, dug through more than 3,000 objects to create mixed message, making and shaping culinary culture in Canada. Handwritten recipe books dating back to the 1800s, the images of homemakers and colorful magazines selling products like margarine. The exhibit takes us through the evolution of Canada's food culture. Our Joanna Draghici got a glimpse at the exhibit at the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library.
The recipe for madras chutney, it's a little bit hard to read.
Describe the writing and what the page actually looks like.
The page is very dirty with food spots and oil spots. The handwriting is very swooping, and it was obviously done with a fountain pen. It calls for a pound of green mangoes or apples, raisins and green ginger, half a pound, garlic and salt, each a half a pound, chilies and peppers, 6 ounces, and treacle, a quarter pound. And that recipe was by Carrie Price, October 1854.
Wow. Chutney. Is that surprising?
It's interesting to think of someone trying to find green mangoes in 1850s Montreal. I am Liz Rodolfo. I'm Special Collections Projects Librarian, and I'm one of the curators of this exhibition.
So we have kind of a curry theme going around, and we also have a curry bottle with curry in it from the 1890s. So British citizens would have been very used to consuming curry in multiple forms, and they brought all those to Canada when they settled on the Canadian territory. I'm Irina Mihalaki. I'm Assistant Professor of Museum Studies at the Faculty of Information. I'm also one of the curators of this exhibition, and I'm very excited to introduce you to some of my favorite objects.
These are handwritten cookbooks many people would probably find in their own home that their grandmother or mother or some relative had written in. We have a bunch of these on display because we want to show how women actually collected and curated their culinary knowledge. And through the recipes in these manuscripts, we can tell all of the different responsibilities that women had as caregivers and providers of the household. Because many of these manuscripts are also full of medical recipes and home recipes for things like ink and cleaning products. So we really see the diversity of what the lady of the house was expected to do through these handwritten cookbooks. So we're moving on to Case 4, which is a case focusing on corporate cookbooks and culinary spokespersonalities.
Tell me a little bit of what we see.